my act together. I'm glad to be here with everybody. Misha, give me just a moment. I just have a latte that I bought 20 minutes ago and have not taken a sip of.
You go right ahead.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that did help. Did you realize that caffeine is the most successful legal drug on the market? That if it were introduced today, it would be a controlled substance. I need to turn out one light, okay? Now, part of what just happened, I did a little living history experiment in World War I. I had some Purex. I needed to mop up a mess my dogs left. Let's not talk about that. And unfortunately, I didn't realize that I had some scrubbing stuff in the bottom of my pan. So I created ammonia gas. I think I'm going to be okay. I've got all the windows open and doors open and letting fresh air come in, and we'll make it. Just tell me when you'd like to start, and we'll start part 3.
You can go ahead and start.
Very good. Greetings to everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our six-part series on the American Civil War. This part looks at the period from roughly the midsummer of 1862 till midsummer of 1863. Most of the stuff that we will cover will appear within a 14-month period of time. Though what I've done is I'm opening it today with the opening lecture, which is about the Confederates on the offensive, summer and fall of 1862. That's the first lecture. Other lectures in the future will not necessarily be totally restricted to the time frame that I've just mentioned, but a bit topical. And if you receive something from Misha that pointed out what the proposed lectures are, several of those proposed lectures are topical lectures that are in this series because that's the way they need to be treated. For example, next week, we're going to look at the experience of African Americans during the American Civil War. It's an appropriate time to bring up the Emancipation Proclamation, but at the same time, we'll talk about how Blacks fitted into the scheme of the actions of the American Civil War before emancipation, before they were emancipated, there we go. And we will also talk about the politics leading to emancipation. And finally, we will discuss the role African-American soldiers played during, during the experience of the American Civil War. Excuse me while I grunt. For those of you who don't understand the culture, grunting is a natural thing for college professors to do. They do a lot of grunting. But today, I'd like to open it up by looking at what are called the Confederates on the Offensive, 1862 summer and fall. In 1862, between roughly August and October, the Confederacy did something only once. And that thing that they did only once was to engage in a coordinated offensive across the South. I'm going to repeat that. They engaged in a coordinated offensive across the South. In other words, there were 3 main armies, and each of these armies went on the offense at the same time. And they had similar goals, similar intents, and it was the only time during the course of the Confederacy that you had any form of cooperation across the South with its military. Now, there will be future offensives, for example, the Gettysburg Campaign of 1863, or any number of smaller campaigns like Sterling Price's raid across Missouri in 1864. But this is the only time that the Confederacy said, let's roll the dice, let's go on the offense and see if we can make something positive happen in terms of seeking independence, in terms of becoming the independent nation recognized as the Confederate States of America. And these three campaigns, you're familiar with most of the battles coming into it, but we tend to emphasize those battles individually. And we don't see how that they fit together in the larger scheme. And so the three campaigns will be the Antietam campaign, which runs roughly from August 29 to September 20th, 1862. And that's, of course, is going to be carried on by Robert E. Lee. And then we have the Kentucky offensive, which is roughly August 14th, 1862 till October the 10th, 1862. And the Kentucky offensive will be a coordinated effort with Confederate General Braxton Bragg as the principal commander, and with an independent action for the most part being done by another Confederate commander by the name of Kirby Smith. And they will cooperate in an invasion of Kentucky for the purpose of bringing Kentucky back into the Confederacy. Well, we'll look at the reasons for these campaigns in a moment. And then the third campaign will be the campaign against Corinth, Mississippi, roughly September 19th through October the 4th, 1862. Corinth, Mississippi, just a short distance south of the boundary with Tennessee, was an important railroad center that had been captured by the Union Army back in the earlier part of the summer. And there was a need, a very strong need on the part of the Confederacy to retake it if possible, but to occupy it for even a week or two for strategic reasons. And if you put all three of these campaigns together, taking the fact that they were done at the same time, they represent the only time during the history of the Confederate States of America that its military forces coordinated from one area to another, trying to put pressure on the North and to, if possible, bring the war to a positive conclusion for the Confederate States of America. Now, having said that, it's always handy to have maps. Share with you a little lesson I learned on my honeymoon, and I won't share with you many lessons that I learned on my honeymoon. But my wife and I had been married less than 24 hours. We left Memphis, Tennessee, where we were married, where both of us lived at the time. And we were on our way to East Tennessee, to the Gatlinburg area, where we planned to, well, have our honeymoon. And back then, the interstates weren't completed. So every so often, you had to get off the interstate onto to back roads until you get up to the next point where the interstate reconvened. So I handed the map to my bride of less than 24 hours and said, Bonnie, how far is it from Cookeville to our next spot? And Crossville, Cookeville to Crossville. And she studied and she studied. And finally she said, about an inch. Now, I didn't say anything. I'm not a wise person, but once in a while I am wise. I didn't say a thing, but the thought went through my mind, you know, there's a lot of things we didn't discuss before we got married, like, can you read a map? And the answer was, she could not read a map. And we were married 47 and a half years before she passed on. And 47 and a half years later, she still couldn't read.
Yeah, let's.
Okay, so everything cool? Okay.
Yeah,
Misha,
everything's good.
okay, thank you. The way things have happened to me in the last 24 hours with electronics, I'm very nervous, as you can imagine. But here's a map of roughly the three areas where things were happening. You'll notice on the far right is the Antietam campaign and the importance of such places as Richmond, the Rappahannock River, Washington, D.C., Harper's Ferry, and ultimately the Battle of Antietam, not too far from where Harper's Ferry is. In the middle, you'll see a portion of Kentucky and Tennessee, and that represents the area that will be covered in the invasion into Kentucky by Bragg and Kirby Smith. And then lastly, on the far left, you'll see circled the area that I'm concerned about when it comes to Corinth, Mississippi. Now you'll notice that Corinth, Mississippi is toward the south, toward the bottom. But Corinth, Mississippi was an important railroad junction and supply base. And those supplies depended on a railroad that went from Corinth, Mississippi up through Jackson, Tennessee, and ultimately to the origin of the supplies that were going to Ulysses S. Grant in Paducah, Kentucky. And so the discussion of that area will be a little bit different, but all three together represented important goals for the Confederacy and an attempt to bring the war to a soon conclusion and an attempt to bring the war to a conclusion favorable to the independence of the Confederate States of America. So this is the Confederate invasions and the Confederates on the offensive in the late summer and early fall of 1862. Late summer 1862, what are the dynamics? What's going on? In other words, why did we choose to begin this series at this point in time? Now, in the last lecture, the one that closed out part 2, I chose to look at the period roughly April of 1862 to June of 1862, which were connoted by 2 significant battles, the Battle of Shiloh in April and the 7 Days Campaign, or the 7 Days Battle, southeast of Richmond in June and early July of 1862. Now, that's a good stopping place because things changed, dramatically changed as a result of those 2 battles. And what changed in essence was that those 2 battles announced to everyone that the American Civil War was not a game. It wasn't an adventure. It wasn't something where, yes, you're risking your life, but in point of fact, most people will be just fine and our side will be victorious, whether that side was the North or the South. But what Shiloh and what the 7 Days Battle southeast of Richmond announced was that this war is going to be murderous, high casualties, gruesome wounds, widows, the loss of loved ones, maiming, amputations, all the kind of gruesome things that young men putting on uniforms and young women swooning when they look at those uniforms, their little hearts go pitter-patter, that was not the nature of war. The war was going to be gruesome, it was going to be hard, and it was going to have some terrible realities to it. As a result of that, as a result of those 2 battles, and everything that had happened up to those 2 battles, but those 2 battles in particular, all of a sudden, North and South volunteerism almost stopped. Volunteerism almost stopped. In other words, it wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't an adventure anymore. And the war had taken on a much more harsh reality than was anticipated back in the halcyon days of April and May and June of 1861. So that's the dynamics we're looking at. The war has changed in its nature by the time you get to the summer of 1862. And of course, the violence led to a dramatic decrease in volunteerism, both North and the South. In a future lecture, I intend to look at how both the North and the South tried to make up for the need of manpower when people, as a free will kind of thing, quit volunteering. And there were various methods, some successful, some failures, and some with incredibly, for lack of a better term, negative consequences that both the North and the South used. And they were different in the North from what they were in the South, and different in the South from what they were in the North. But for right now, let's just say that in the summer of 1862, there had come to be the realization that the war was of a vastly different character from what it had been in the slightly over a year that preceded the summer of 1862. On the other hand, the soldiers that were in the Southern Army and the soldiers that were in the Northern Army had also changed. One of the themes that we looked at in our last series of lectures is that officers and men alike were amateurs, that you had people who weren't acculturated to war, who came into the conflict, sometimes well armed, sometimes armed with nothing more than shotguns and Bowie knives, and sometimes with outlandish uniforms, rarely with standard uniforms, and sometimes virtually no uniform at all, especially in the Confederate cause. And that was the early nature of the war. But by the summer of 1862, those soldiers had, as a historian of the 1960s that I grew up with pointed out, they had on-the-job training. In other words, it wasn't a military culture, but these people had been in the military long enough and they'd experienced a battle or two. They knew what to expect. They had a pretty good idea of what worked and what didn't work. They could look at a wound that they received and know they would be okay, or they could look at a wound that they received and they would turn out, they would blanch and turn white because they knew the wound was fatal. And so there's a change in the armies, change in both armies, Northern and Southern, as the soldiers by the summer of 1862 are becoming more and more professional. A statistic that I shared with you in the last lecture, I want to remind you of. It's a rough estimate, but approximately 80% of the soldiers that participated in the Civil War from the beginning to the end, and this includes people that volunteered in 1861 and were still there in 1865, 80% of the soldiers that participated in the Civil War volunteered prior to the summer of 1862. The remaining 20% would end up coming into the conflict beyond the summer of 1862. So it's kind of weird. You think of young men turning of age, say 17 or 18 years old, and it's 1864, and they go off to join their brothers. That wasn't happening. After the summer of 1862, mothers who had discouraged the older brothers from joining either the Union or Confederate armies, by the summer of 1862, these same mothers and the same wives and the same sisters and the same fathers were saying to their sons, don't. You'll get killed, or you'll get maimed. Don't join. And so the war is going to be fought by well-trained veterans for the most part, but they got their training experiencing war with only a minimum of basic training, as we would say today. On the other hand, as you look at the officers, by the time you get to 1862, and by the time you get to the summer of 1862, the officers are beginning to be sorted out. Commanders and officers of merit are beginning to appear, but you're still having appear commanders and officers of not so much merit out there. It's going to take a long time to determine which officers, especially general officers or commanding officers, are effective. And as a result, you begin to see by the summer of 1862, the emergence, for example, of Ulysses S. Grant in the Union Army, and of course, Robert E. Lee in the Confederate Army. These would be the two best examples of commanders who are being sorted out and end up being commanders of merit. But on the other hand, there are people who are put into important positions, people of talent, people of ability, but people of lesser talent and lesser ability who will not make particularly good commanders. And two examples that we'll be looking at today are William Rosecrans, who was a Union general, and he'll be in command at the Battle of the Second Battle of Corinth in October of 1862, and of course Braxton Bragg, who will be the commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Let me just take a second to share with you something that's kind of confusing. The Confederacy and the Union had a habit of using nomenclature, that is to say, using naming from different sources. The North tended to name battles and armies after bodies of water. The South tended to name its battles and its armies after places. So in the South, you'll have the Army of Tennessee, which is named after the state of Tennessee. And Braxton Bragg was the commander for a time of the Army of Tennessee. By contrast, in the North, you're going to have the Army of the Tennessee. That's the Northern term, the Army of the Tennessee, in this case, commanded by Ulysses S. Grant, and it's named after the Tennessee River. Or in the case of Rosecrans, he will later be the commander of the Cumberland Army, and that's named after the Cumberland River. And there are other commanders. There'll be commanders of the Army of the Ohio, and of course that's referring to the Ohio River. And where that really gets to be fun is occasionally you'll have the Army of Tennessee, commanded by Braxton Bragg in this case, coming into conflict with the Army of the Tennessee, say commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. And if I haven't gotten you too confused and too lost, then you're not paying attention because it's really does get confusing when you're trying to figure out which army is named which way and whether it's a Union or a Confederate Army. So where do we go from there? Well, let's talk about August of 1862. And we'll focus on August of 1863 from the perspective of the Confederate States of America, because they're the ones that are becoming aggressive. The military thinkers, the policy makers in the Confederacy of 1862 are the ones that organize what's about to happen. And let me, a personal message to Misha. Misha, be sure and give me a time every once in a while, which you're doing, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So let's look at the Confederate States of America, August 1862, and find out what they're trying to do with these three invasions, or three aggressive actions, because the Battle of Corinth was not an invasion, but there's two invasions plus the campaign against Corinth, Mississippi. The two invasions are into Maryland. That's going to be the Antietam campaign with Robert E. Lee, and the invasion into Kentucky, which will be led basically by Braxton Bragg. And in Maryland, what was the thinking of Robert E. Lee? Well, it was very simple. First of all, Maryland is a slave state. And in fact, all things being equal, it probably should have seceded. But as you remember from earlier lectures, the Lincoln administration, desperate to keep Maryland in the Union, engaged in nothing that was sophisticated, not at all sophisticated. They literally occupied Maryland, arrested in an emergency sort of situation anyone that seemed to have Confederate sympathizing, especially if they were of a political nature, prevented to the best of their ability recruiting for the Confederacy. And Maryland was literally occupied by the soldiers loyal to Abraham Lincoln and to the North. The thinking then on the part of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and others was that, that Maryland was ripe to join the Confederacy. All it would take would be a significant Confederate presence, and all of a sudden, the people of Maryland would declare their loyalty to the Confederacy. A Confederate government could be established, and equally important, volunteers anxious to fight for the cause of slavery, to fight for the cause of Southern independence, would be flooding into the Confederate Army from Maryland. And so part of the reason for invading Maryland was to help bring that state into the Confederate nation and to bring as many volunteers as possible into the nation. That was the thinking that was behind moving into Maryland. Additionally, a movement into Maryland would force the USA probably to abandon Washington, D.C. If Maryland was to come solidly over to the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by the Confederate States of America, and it would become untenable. At the very least, that would force the Lincoln administration and the government, that was the government of the Union, to relocate its capital. Most people think it probably would have been Columbus, Ohio, would be the most likely place that that the new capital would have been established. But whatever the case, that would be another benefit. And then third, though it's not listed on the screen as you see it here, there was also the belief in each of these cases that that support for the Union was thin. I'll repeat that. There is a belief in the South that support for the Union is thin. Now, you might remember from earlier lectures, there had been a belief in the North that support for secession was thin. And that turned out not to be true, that support for secession was very powerful. But as you get to the summer of 1862, there's a lot of editorials in Northern newspapers. There's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of complaining, popular songs. All of these indicated a tremendous amount of war weariness in the North. And so if the Confederacy could prove itself viable, prove its military viable, then that might be just enough to push the population of the North to sue for peace, to bring an end to this terrible, cruel war that was killing sons and brothers and husbands. And so there was this belief in all three campaigns that if we can just prove that the Confederacy is powerful, it's strong, it's viable, then the North will see the futility of trying to keep the Southern states within its boundary. So that is a major reason, not only in Maryland, but also Kentucky, and for that matter, in the campaign in northern Mississippi in 1862. Kentucky, pretty much the same story. Again, Kentucky is a slave state, but the Confederate units had to flee. A Confederate government was established, but it was a token government. And there was this belief that if we invaded back into Kentucky, the Southern armies would be welcomed as liberators and as liberators, volunteers would be flooding in, and it would be a positive thing to bring new life, new material, new strength to the Confederate military. In addition to that, there was a need to legitimize the Confederate government of Kentucky. Something interesting had happened in Kentucky. A token Confederate government had been established. A governor had been selected, but that governor was killed at the Battle of Shiloh. In other words, he was accompanying Confederate soldiers, and as their legal representative in the government. And he determined that if he was going to do his part, he should participate in the battle. So he literally signed on for one day. In other words, he took the pledge to serve for one day as a private in the Confederate Army. And that was his last day. He was killed on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, becoming, ironically, the only governor, Northern or Southern, to be killed in battle during the American Civil War. A new governor had been appointed, but it was felt that he needed to take his oath of office on Kentucky soil. And so the new governor was accompanying the soldiers as they went northward into Kentucky for the intent of being inaugurated and giving legitimacy to the Confederate Kentucky government. Another thing is that if your invasion of Kentucky is successful, then the boundary line is going to be the Ohio River. And if you can force the North to have to defend the Ohio River, that's going to bring soldiers who are currently invading deep into Mississippi northward, and to take the pressure off of especially the area where Ulysses S. Grant is marching down Mississippi, trying to get to Vicksburg from the east side, from the non-river side. And who knows? You might even recover Nashville. Nashville had fallen to the Union Army. It was occupied by the Union Army, but a successful invasion of Kentucky might force the Union to abandon Nashville. And a long shot, but it might also rekindle Confederate support in Missouri. In other words, there are grand ideas that are involved, and the reason for these three offensive movements in the late summer of 1862. The Mississippi campaign, on the other hand, involves trying to occupy Corinth, Mississippi. And here the difference is a little bit different. It's not technically an invasion, as is in the case of Kentucky and Maryland, but it is an attempt to counteract an invasion. It's an attempt to counteract an invasion. And of course, the invasion is the successful movement southward of the Union Army of the Tennessee under the command of Ulysses S. Grant. At the moment, Ulysses S. Grant was marching south of Corinth. He possessed a core army of about 30,000 soldiers, but he was dependent on a narrow supply line. And that supply line went straight through Corinth, Mississippi. And in fact, Corinth, Mississippi became the southern base for Grant's supply line. It took several tons of material every day, several tons of material to feed soldiers, to feed horses, to provide medical supplies, to provide gunpowder, to provide cannon, to provide all the stuff necessary in fighting a war, all the stuff necessary in fighting a war. And all of that came down a single railroad beginning in Paducah, Kentucky, going through Corinth, Mississippi, and heading southward. If the Confederacy could cut off that supply line, then Ulysses S. Grant, at a minimum, would have to retreat back into Tennessee, or even better, he might very well be cut off and with his army starving, forced into surrender. And so that's the assumption of the military campaign attacking Corinth, Mississippi in the autumn of 1862. And then there are a couple of other assumptions key to all three. We've already mentioned the fact that there was a belief that there was war weariness in the North, that support for the war was thin in the North. Now, it turns out they weren't correct, but that's neither here nor there. That was the belief among the Confederates. And so again, a powerful Confederate response may very well cause the North to say, let's negotiate a peace. And lastly, internationally, England and France, there was a real need on the part of the Confederacy to gain recognition from England and France, especially England. And the English government was highly sympathetic to the idea of recognizing the Confederacy. The French government was even more keen on recognizing the Confederacy, but the French government was not as stable and it was not as strong as the British government. So the French are not going to recognize the Confederacy unless first the English do it. And there was the hope that this three successful military activities, 2 invasions and the counter invasion in Mississippi, that these 3 successful invasions will lead to foreign intervention, to recognition of the Confederacy, to openly supplying the Confederacy, to putting diplomatic pressure on the part of these foreign governments on the Union to negotiate peace and to bring an end to the conflict. So there's a lot at stake. Here we have in the fall of 1862, probably, I would argue, probably the best opportunity for success for the Confederates. But that success will depend on military success in all 3 of these areas. Well, let's look at the geography and the military forces involved. Basically, notice where the armies were. At the opening of this engagement, Robert E. Lee is sitting on the south side of what's called the Rappahannock River, and never in my life have I ever been able to pronounce it exactly right, I'll be honest with you. But that river is the key for most of the Civil War to knowing what's going on. I've been there. It's where Fredericksburg is. It's where Chancellorsville is. And it's a natural defense line. It's a small river, but it cuts a powerful gorge through the Virginia countryside so that you do not easily cross the Rappahannock. And if Lee needed a place to put his army, to block that army, the armies of the North from invading down into Richmond, that's where he's going to be. And that's where he was at the beginning of this operation. To the west, Braxton Bragg will be in Chattanooga, and Kirby Smith in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they will branch northward from those 2 locations in their invasion of Kentucky. And in the far west, Earl Van Dorn and Sterling Price, both of whom normally are west of the Mississippi, will have been transferred across the Mississippi River and to combine their forces, led by Earl Van Dorn, to challenge and to cut off Ulysses S. Grant, as Grant is much deeper in the Mississippi. And you'll see basically in the Memphis area and just south of the Memphis area where the armies of Van Dorn and Price will be located. So let's look at these 3 campaigns and see what happens in them. As we look at the 3 campaigns, we'll notice that you begin with the Antietam campaign, the most famous of them. August 29 through September 20th, 1862. Robert E. Lee is one of the most important generals of the Civil War, and that goes without saying. But what makes him important is that he understood tactics better than anyone in the Civil War era in America. Say that again. He understood tactics, how to fight a battle, to a lesser extent, how to fight a campaign, but how to fight a battle better than anyone. In fact, if I were to be critical of Robert E. Lee, it's a criticism that's actually a compliment. Robert E. Lee would have had far greater success if he was a World War II commander than he had as a Civil War commander, because the tactics that he used, the innovative things that he did, would have worked better if he'd have had the kind of equipment that was available to armies in the World War II period. In other words, he would have been, quite honestly, probably the rough equivalent of Patton, and an understanding of how to use your military in powerful, bold ways. And that's my only criticism of Robert E. Lee as a tactician. In other words, he used tactics that were radically different from anything else any other commander was doing during the American Civil War. In fact, if you go to West Point, or if you go to any military academy anywhere in the world, and the tactics of Robert E. Lee are always taught in the classroom. And he becomes a model of how to fight a battle across the board. Now, having said that, almost all the other commanders, including Grant, including Sherman, including any number of Union or Confederate generals that you wish to make, they had virtues and they had faults, but none of them could engage in the kind of tactical activities that, if you notice me struggling a bit here, I need to sneeze. But as you well know, the moment you say you need to sneeze, it goes away. And so I've accomplished that. I said I needed to sneeze and it went away. There we go. Most Civil War battles, and we're going to see this in a moment, were nothing more than slugfest. Line the soldiers up and beat on each other's armies until one side or the other departs. In other words, the whole purpose of firing your weapons at the other side is to give them a message. And that message is simple. You do not wish to be here. Why don't you go away? You don't wish to be here. Please go away. And except the word please was accompanied by shrapnel and mini balls and a lot of other things. In the case of Lee, there is great sophistication as to what he does. And that sophistication will lead to success, and to lead to why he's still popular today and why he's studied all over the world today. Now, Lee had a real problem. If you see his position next to Fredericksburg, the Army of Northern Virginia, which was his army, had roughly about 55,000 troops under his direct command. Now, there were additional soldiers southeast of Richmond, keeping an eye on General McClellan, and there were additional Confederate soldiers in various other places. But the army of Robert E. Lee was roughly about 55,000 in this campaign. By contrast, his principal opponent initially is going to be John Pope. And John Pope will have 77,000 men, which right there tells you that Lee is outnumbered. But then if you go southeast of Richmond, where you see McClellan was at the opening of this outfit, McClellan had about 88,000 men with him. But those 88,000 men had been defeated in the 7 Days Battle, or more specifically, McClellan had been defeated in the 7 Day battles. And and he was not going to be offensive. In other words, in fact, he had already been given orders, basically leave a small contingency at the area around Fortress Monroe, and bring your troops back to the Washington, D.C. area, because Washington, D.C. felt very vulnerable, and they wanted McClellan and his troops back protecting Washington, D.C. So Lee then had an opportunity, and that was a classic Napoleonic opportunity. If you're outnumbered, defeat your enemy one at a time. And so in this campaign, Lee will first go against John Pope and try to defeat his army. And if successful, and he will be successful, if successful, then he hoped he would have time to invade into Maryland and have success in Maryland before McClellan and his army could be transferred back to the Washington, D.C. area. And who knows, he might even face McClellan, who he felt confident he could defeat. And so that's kind of an overview of where things stood in August of 1862 as you're looking at the map. So let's talk about McClellan, George B. McClellan. If you're talking about worthy commanders, in so many ways, George B. McClellan was part of the best talent that was around. He was worthy to command the Army of the Potomac. He had been a star. He was relatively young, but he was a star from the moment he graduated from West Point. He had a number of things that he got to do because of his talent and his understanding and his ability. And probably the best known of these is that he became the American observer to the Crimean War, which was England and France and the Turks fighting against the Russians on the Crimean Peninsula. And anytime you have a war, you have foreign observers who are allowed to be with the armies because they're trying to make an assessment, they're trying to learn, and this was just a way of sharing. And so he was the American representative with the British Army in the Crimean War. And he did learn. His reports that he brought back, the things that he saw, became part of the military practices of the United States. Among other things, he was really impressed with the saddles, the horse saddles that the French had. They were comfortable. They were utilitarian. They fit the horses well. And so when he came back, he not only gave his reports, but he designed a similar saddle for the American military. It became known as the McClellan saddle, and it was used all the way from before the American Civil War until the U.S. Army disbanded its cavalry crew in the early part of the 20th century. And so here was a man of tremendous ability and recognized before the war began. He early rises to prominence after some small victories in Virginia, and Abraham Lincoln is impressed with him. In fact, too impressed, because he makes him not only the commander of the Army of the Potomac, which is the Union Army, and notice it's named after a river, but he also is appointed to be general-in-chief, which was a huge mistake because that asked him to do too much. And so Lincoln corrects that very quickly. He brings in Henry Halleck to replace him. But he's the commander of the Army of the Potomac, the principal Union Army in the Washington, D.C. area. So what does he do? He inherits an army that's just been defeated at the first Bull Run. He inherits an army that are amateurs. And he very quickly makes it the best trained army in the Western Hemisphere. He engages a regimentation of training and of discipline and of self-assurance that makes the Army of the Potomac quite quickly into a well-oiled and well-qualified military. And in that, he was very successful. his soldiers loved him. Everywhere he went, the soldiers would line the roads, and they were cheering because they felt like he knew what he was doing. They felt like they were being trained to do what they were supposed to do, and they felt confidence in him. The problem, of course, was that there were elements of George B. McClellan that were not so worthy. And the not so worthy in the case of McClellan is that he was overly cautious. And I was thinking the other day, who would I compare him to? And it dawned on me that probably in World War II, Bernard Montgomery had success when he had overwhelming power, when he was fighting what's called a set piece battle, where he lines everything up and then begins to move his units almost like you'd move a chessboard. And McClellan probably would have had success there, except he was fighting the American Civil War. And like Robert E. Lee, he was trying to do things with a Civil War army that wouldn't be possible until you get to World War II. And a classic example of that is the campaign that he had just lost. Campaign that he lost during the spring of 1862, when in a highly innovative way, he decided to attack what you might call the soft underbelly of the Confederacy. It sounds like Churchill deciding to invade Italy and calling Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. Well, he got the idea of going to Fortress Monroe, which is on the coast, having the Navy transport his army there, and then attacking from the southeast. And in theory, that would have worked. But if you look at the illustration, you've got a good sense of what that part of the world looked like. Heavily forested, dark, difficult terrain, and he went very slow, taking months to go about 20 miles. And during that period of time, the Confederates had time to pull in reinforcements to trap him. And then after the severe wounding of Joseph E. Johnston and being replaced by Robert E. Lee, you had a bold commander who quickly turned on him and in 7 days forced him all the way back to the very edge of that peninsula. And so when the whole thing begins to develop, he's bottled up with his army in a remote part of Virginia. And all of a sudden, Robert E. Lee has the freedom to deal with someone else. And that someone else was John Pope. John Pope, General John Pope, an interesting guy. John Pope was a man of ability. No question about it. Regular Army, graduate of West Point. Like any other graduate of West Point, had never commanded more than a few hundred troops at a time. But he had a good sense of what it took to command troops. Was initially liked by his soldiers when he started the war out fighting in the West. And the West was producing and sorting out the good Union troops from the mediocre and poor Union commanders. And he was the land army commander in the naval actions at Island Number 10, and proved to be someone who was highly successful in getting his troops to do very difficult things, and it got him a lot of recognition. So Abraham Lincoln said, "This man fights, and we need to protect Washington, D.C. while McClellan's off doing his thing." And he decided John Pope was the man. John Pope had abilities. Unfortunately, for John Pope, he did have abilities, but he was up against the Confederate varsity, no question about it. In other words, John Pope was not up to facing a commander as brilliant and as resourceful and as dramatically active as Robert E. Lee. In other words, you have a competent person in John Pope, you have a brilliant person in Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee had first-class subcommanders, Longstreet, James Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson, A.P. Hill. Now, at this point in time, A.P. Hill is a subcommander under Jackson. After Jackson's death, he will essentially rise to fill some of the void that Jackson left, but he'll play an important role in the coming campaign. So the best commanders that the Confederacy had are going to go up against John Pope, who was, well, competent. But competency up against superstars is going to make you look not as competent as you really are. So the campaign that evolves consists of three major engagements. The first will be the Second Battle of Bull Run. It's in this battle that Lee thoroughly defeats John Pope. And then, having neutralized Pope and neutralized his army, Lee feels free to invade into Maryland. And in the Maryland campaign, there are going to be two major battles. One of them will be the siege and capture of Harper's Ferry, which will be done by a portion of Lee's army under Stonewall Jackson. And then, of course, ultimately, the Battle of Antietam, which will be the climax of this campaign. So the first thing we need to know is what happens in Second Bull Run. And here you begin to see Lee's brilliance. Lee is not just simply going to line his army up for a slugfest. Instead, Lee's going to go up against Pope, and he's going to thoroughly confuse Pope. Pope outnumbers him. Pope is between him and Washington, D.C. By any logical reasoning, Pope should be able to contain Robert E. Lee and protect Washington, D.C. But as we see, we're going to see Pope and his army is thoroughly defeated. Part of that defeat and the success on the part of the Confederacy is the responsible is laid to the benefit of the actions of Lee's Confederate cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart. Lee uses his cavalry in a highly innovative way. Normally, cavalry existed basically as scouts. Go out and find the enemy and tell your commander where it is. Go out and find dangers and tell him what to avoid. But Lee says to Stuart, ride around the other side of Pope's army. Create as much confusion as you can. Make it look as if you're more powerful than you are. And Stuart has a great success doing that. He leads Lee's cavalry first to the west, then to the north, and then rides on the other side of Pope's command, and he begins to attack Pope's supply lines and captures one of his main bases. And all of a sudden, Pope doesn't know where to turn. He's not only being weakened with a lack of supplies, but he really is confused as to where Robert E. Lee's army is. And this causes him to march his soldiers backwards and forward and tire them out. It causes him to look bad to his soldiers as if he doesn't know what he's doing. And then once this has happened and confusion is sown into the Union Army under Pope, then Lee begins his own invasion. He heads northward until he gets to Manassas. And at Manassas, Lee has divided his army into two parts, each of which has roughly about 25,000 soldiers. Stonewall Jackson is in command of one part, and Longstreet, James Longstreet, is in command of the other part, and they're cooperating. On August 29, Jackson suddenly appears on the old Bull Run battlefield, the same battlefield where the Northern soldiers had been defeated back in July of 1861. And what Jackson does, he goes up to an uncompleted railroad embankment. In other words, the railroad is being built, but it hasn't been completed. But what this gives him is a natural defense line. It's almost as if it was trenches. And so he could line his 25,000 troops along this line. And it gave the impression to Pope, who he made sure Pope saw him, that Pope had half of Lee's army trapped. Now remember, Lee's army under Jackson is just 25,000 soldiers, and Pope has roughly about 70 to 77,000 soldiers. And so Pope decides to attack Jackson and to defeat him. Only Pope doesn't realize that Jackson has a strong, intensely strong defensive position, and Jackson holds Pope off during the first day. That was intentional. And as the first day comes to an end, Longstreet's half of the army begins to show up. And apparently Pope was not quite aware that Longstreet was there in the numbers he was, which is the other half of Lee's army. And so what happens is that when you open up the second day, Longstreet has formed a line on the Confederate right flank, the Union left flank, and he has outflanked Pope's army. And so all of a sudden, Longstreet lets loose on the second day massive artillery activities that goes along the entire length of the Union Army, thoroughly confuses the Union soldiers and commanders, as well as causing massive casualties. And then all of a sudden, Longstreet's army attacks en masse the flank of Pope's army, and Pope has to admit defeat, that he's overwhelmed. Now, at that point, Pope begins to retreat, as you see on the map, to Centerville, which is back toward Washington. And while that retreat is evident of a defeated army, it's not a shattered army. In other words, a year before, almost exactly a year before, there had been a defeat of the Union Army, and the troops panicked. And Washington, D.C. was open to invasion if the Confederates had been able to do it, which they were not, because their soldiers were just as green. But Pope's army retreats, sets up a new battle line. It's defeated, but it's not destroyed. It doesn't get the same panic as the first had, because they were veteran soldiers by this time. On the other hand, Lee has accomplished what he set out to do. He's neutralized Pope's army. Pope's army is no longer a threat to him. And so the first element of the invasion has been a success. At that point, Lee and Jefferson Davis debate. On the one hand, if Lee was to be bold, he would invade Maryland and possibly accomplish all the goals that the Confederacy would like to see. On the other hand, Lee's invading Maryland puts Richmond at risk if the Union Army decides to respond. The good news for Lee, and Lee understood this, was that McClellan was not going to march back toward Richmond with the overwhelming numbers that he had, that he was in fact under orders to send his army to Washington. And Lee hoped that he had enough time to invade Maryland, to accomplish what he was trying to do in Maryland before McClellan and the Army of the Potomac could be reorganized back in the Washington, D.C. area. And so at that point, Lee, beginning on September 3rd, invades into Maryland, basically strikes out for Frederick. It was hoped that Frederick would be the headquarters where the Confederate Army would set up, and volunteers who wanted to join Maryland units and fight for the state of Maryland and fight for the Confederacy would join him in Frederick, Maryland. Now here, Lee made a mistake, and it wasn't a military mistake, so to speak, as it was a political mistake. And the mistake was that the Frederick, Maryland area, was heavily pro-Union. And support for the Confederacy was in Eastern Maryland, in the Baltimore area, in the Annapolis area. And whereas when you get out to Frederick, you're in the foothills and mountain area, and their support for the Confederacy was weak, very weak. And so the expected volunteers from Maryland didn't show up. Very few recruits, volunteers from Maryland joined with Lee's army at that point. Of course, the other problem was this is 1862, and enthusiasm for joining the army in general had declined. So even people who might have a year before been interested in joining, by this time were quite aware of how dangerous and how gruesome experience in the military could be. And so the expectation of large numbers of citizens of Maryland joining Lee's army did not materialize. So after spending a very short time in Frederick, Lee begins to realize that he is overextended. He begins to see troops from the Army of the Potomac forming up, and the Army of the Potomac is reconfiguring between him and Washington, D.C. And Lee knows it's time to change his plans, to expect to retreat back into Virginia. But he's not ready to do that yet. He still feels he can accomplish some things. And so he divides his army, sending Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, down to Harper's Ferry. Lee wanted to capture the military supplies at Harper's Ferry. Lee wanted to capture the soldiers there. Lee wanted to get a small number of soldiers at Harper's Ferry out of the way so they wouldn't oppose him as Lee was going to make his way back to Virginia. And so Jackson was sent to Harper's Ferry, which he did besiege for 3 days, and he captured. And with him was A.P. Hill. But now something happens to Lee totally unexpected. As Lee is leaving Frederick, he issues orders dividing his army, sending different commands to different places. And these are written down, very specific. And an officer, we assume an officer, needing some paper to wrap his cigars, wrap the cigars in paper and put string around it to hold them together, and then lost them. And 3 days later, as McClellan's army marched into Frederick, a Union private found a gold mine, 3 excellent Havana cigars wrapped in a sheet of paper. Fortunately for McClellan, the soldier was literate and he read what was on the paper, which were Lee's orders. And McClellan was furnished with a golden opportunity of knowing exactly where the various elements of Lee's command was. And it was an opportunity for the Union to defeat Lee in total. And McClellan embraced it. He thought it was a great thing. He even boasted, "I've got Robert E. Lee where I need him. He will be destroyed." The problem was McClellan had what Lincoln called the slows. And he hesitated for about 18 hours. And sometimes in the military, 18 hours can make all the difference in the world. And it gave Lee time to issue commands to have his army reassemble. Now, if Lee had had his way, the army would have reassembled south of Potomac River. But then Lee ran into another problem. And that other problem was that the Potomac River all of a sudden was flooding. There had been some rainstorms in the mountains, the river rose, and his army was trapped on the north side of the Potomac at a place called Sharpsburg. And Sharpsburg, Lee ordered his soldiers to reassemble there. And it's at Sharpsburg then McClellan shows up. And McClellan outnumbers Lee roughly about 88,000 to 40,000. Lee is heavily outnumbered. And if McClellan had simply engaged in a slugfest, he had simply ordered all of his troops to move forward, Lee's army would have been destroyed at what becomes known as the Battle of Antietam Creek. Remember, the Union names this battle as after bodies of water. The Confederates named the same battle the Battle of Sharpsburg. Now, I won't go into great detail about this battle. It's a fascinating battle to study. But what happens is that Lee makes his left flank as strong as he can make it. He makes his center as strong as he can make it. Where Lee has a problem is in his right flank. While he has thousands of soldiers on his left flank and his center, on his right flank, which borders Antietam Creek, he literally has only a few hundred soldiers. If the Union Army charged across the creek and pressed that area, Lee's entire army would have been rolled up. But McClellan did not choose to do that. McClellan hit Lee first on his far left flank in the morning, and the slaughter between the two armies is horrendous. It is a slugfest, and thousands of men are maimed, and many are killed. It is the bloodiest single day of the American Civil War. And when the two sides became exhausted on the left flank, Lee moved some of his soldiers to bolster the center. And again, during the mid part of the day, the center portion of the attack occurs, where you see the soldiers, the deceased Confederate soldiers laid out in the picture. That's in the center part of the battle. And again, it's a slugfest, neither side giving way. But again, Lee's right flank has only a few hundred men, not thousands of men, and not bundles of artillery, just a few hundred men standing up against potentially thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Union soldiers. Those soldiers are commanded by Burnside, and Burnside looks at the creek and decides that that creek is going to be difficult to cross. And so he delays until late afternoon. And finally, in late afternoon, a Union colonel, recent graduate of West Point, very low in his class, by the name of Custer. Custer is getting frustrated because nobody's going across the creek. So he takes his horse and he literally rides the horse out into the creek, and it comes up to about halfway up the horse's legs. And he sends word back to Burnside and says, basically, the army can make its way across this creek, to the other side. We might take casualties, but we make it to the other side. And so finally, after forming up late in the afternoon, that portion of McClellan's army goes into action. And it looks like Lee's army is going to be totally destroyed because Lee doesn't have but a handful of soldiers there. But A.P. Hill, who had been left at Harper's Ferry to take care of prisoners, to deal with getting more supplies from that place, A.P. Hill has pushed his command, what's called the Light Division, and made them march unreasonably hard for an entire day. And his soldiers start coming onto the field. And as A.P. Hill's soldiers come onto the field, there are two things that are happening. One, the Confederates begin to have sufficient troops to counteract Burnside's attack. But secondly, those Confederates are dressed in blue uniforms because the Confederates had been wearing practically rags. Their uniforms had worn out. And so they put on Union uniforms, which normally they would have bleached to make them gray, but they didn't have time. So they were wearing blue uniforms. So the Union becomes confused, and the confusion lasts just long enough for the Confederates to form a line and to prevent Lee's army from being destroyed at that point. And the day comes to an end, but not the noise. The noise of bellowing wounded horses, the screams of ghastly armed men dying, the sound of cannon and of ambulances and of men responding to the knife as amputations are going on, rings heavily through the night. But the battle has come to an end. Lee still has a problem. He's trapped. The Potomac River is too high to get across. And so for a day and a half, his line is formed. He's facing McClellan. And again, McClellan at any point could have attacked Lee and brought Lee's army to its end. McClellan has convinced himself that Lee's army is too strong and he does not attack. And after a day and a half, the Potomac River begins to recede. It gets shallow enough that it can be forded, and Lee crosses and then heads back to the Rappahannock River, and that's the end of that campaign. The Kentucky offensive. The Kentucky offensive. If the Confederate varsity fought the Antietam campaign, and it became a pretty desperate campaign at the end, the Kentucky offensive was fought by one pretty good commander, that's Kirby Smith, and one disastrous commander, that's Braxton Bragg, okay? And Braxton Bragg will have overall command, but Kirby Smith will have an independent army. And that's going to be August through October of 1862. Kirby Smith. What can you say about Kirby Smith? Typical resume, West Point graduate, knew what he was doing, has a small command that's in Knoxville. His principal purpose in being in Knoxville was to fight guerrillas. The East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad, going all the way from Chattanooga across East Tennessee and into Virginia, was absolutely critical to the Confederate cause. And pro-Union guerrillas in the East Tennessee mountains, East Tennessee was overwhelmingly in favor of the Union. They were making it difficult for Confederates to use that railroad. So the reason Kirby Smith is in Knoxville has nothing to do with an invasion of Kentucky and everything to do with having a cavalry command that can respond quickly to any guerrilla activities threatening the bridges. In fact, he was in the habit of capturing guerrillas, and the standard operating procedure, if they didn't really have a unit, was to hang them right from the bridge that they were trying to destroy. And there were quite a number of bridges that quite literally were decorated with the hanging bodies of pro-Union guerrillas because of Kirby Smith. And it wasn't that Kirby Smith was a bad guy. He's fighting a nasty war, but he's competent. He's a good commander. And later in the war, he will be given command of the Trans-Mississippi District after that district has been cut off from the rest of society, and retains command of the Trans-Mississippi District until the end of the war, where he does well. He does very well for the Confederacy under the circumstances. In fact, his command is so successful that the Confederacy west of the Mississippi was sometimes referred to as Kirby Smithdom, okay, because for all practical purposes, he was not just the military commander, but he was the ruler of the Confederacy west of the Mississippi River, but that's in the future. Kirby Smith is ordered to take his army of about 6,500 men and to head north into Kentucky and to coordinate in this activity with Braxton Bragg, who will be leaving from Chattanooga and heading north. And the idea was that the two of them would unite roughly around Lexington And then from there, it's a short distance over to Frankfort, the capital of Kentucky, where they will inaugurate the new governor and will proclaim the Confederate government of Kentucky and invite people in Kentucky to join the Confederate cause. That's the plan. To make a long story short, Kirby Smith has success. He's a bold commander. He's kind of he's a lot like Robert E. Lee. He's a lot like Ulysses S. Grant. And so Kirby Smith heads north. On August the 30th, he fights a battle called the Battle of Richmond. In this battle, he comes into contact with a rather strange Union commander, William Bull Nelson. Nelson had an army of about 6,800. They had about the same number of soldiers. But Nelson actually was a slaveholder, pretty good sized slaveholder, and he favored slavery. But he also recognized that the Confederacy would probably be defeated, and he figured the only way to preserve slavery was to cast his lot with the Union, hoping that the support of slaveholders for the Union would keep the Lincoln government from putting an end to slavery. It's a little convoluted reasoning there, but that was his reasoning. And there were others that had that reasoning, okay? At any rate, Bull Nelson had been an officer in the United States Navy, but he ends up becoming a general in the United States Army, General of Volunteers. It's not that he was incompetent, he was just simply overwhelmed by a better commander. And so at the Battle of Richmond, a very sharp, very quick battle, a good portion of Nelson's command was cut off and forced to surrender. About 4,000 of the 6,800 soldiers surrendered to the Confederates at Richmond. It was a major defeat for the Union. I have a little more to say about Nelson at the end of this lecture, but Kirby Smith is a bold commander, and given the small army that he had, he made the best that he could with that small army. Meanwhile, Bragg moves north, rather plotting. They meet in Lexington as planned, and together they marched the short distance to Frankfort. They inaugurate the governor. They put a call for volunteers to the Confederate cause, and virtually nobody comes. By this time, again, you're at a period of time when even if you favored the Confederacy, you knew the price you paid when you joined the Army. There was not enthusiasm for joining either Army, Union or Confederate, but especially the Confederate Army. So it was a disappointment to the Confederates. The massive number of volunteers didn't show up. At this point, the Union is beginning to respond en masse to this Confederate invasion under General Buell, Northern General Buell. And Bragg decides that it's time to retreat to what he considered to be a strong defensive position, which was in the community of Perryville. And it's at Perryville that he draws up a line on top of a hill. And Buell has command of about 50,000 soldiers, but only about 22,000 make it to Perryville. And so the numbers are about 22,000 for the Union, 16,000 for the Confederates. In terms of a battle, it's nothing like the sophistication of Lee's army. You have the Union lining up on one set of ridge, and the Confederates lining up on another set of ridge. There's a valley in between, and they take turns charging each other and killing each other in mass numbers. In the end, it is the second deadliest battle in the Western Theater. The deadliest battle, of course, is the second deadliest battle is, of course, Shiloh. And it is by far the deadliest battle fought in the state of Kentucky. In terms of a victory, it was a tactical victory for Braxton Bragg. Kirby Smith does not participate. He's a short distance away. He arrives when the battle really is coming to an end. But Kirby Smith does an assessment, and he really sees that the Confederacy has won. And Kirby Smith says, "Look, I'm bringing in some 6,000 additional soldiers. Let me go on the offensive." And Bragg says no. Bragg says that his supply lines is too extended. He feels like a large number of Union soldiers on the way. And I mean, Kirby Smith literally begged to go on the offensive to make this victory into an even greater victory by destroying the Union Army. And Braxton Bragg refuses to give him permission. At that point, after a day's rest, Braxton Bragg orders the entire Confederate Army, Kirby Smith as well as Braxton Bragg, to begin a retreat back to Knoxville. And in the course of that retreat, it is successful, but the Confederates lose their baggage train, and in the end, the Confederacy suffers very heavily in terms of losses, not only in the battle, but in the retreat that follows. I wrote a book. I've only really published 2 books, but my first book was entitled Class in Tennessee's Confederate Soldiers. And it deals with the remembrances of some 1,600 Confederate veterans in a questionnaire that was sent out late in their lives. And these men remembered 5 generals in particular, and 2 of them extremely negative. And one of the 2 that's remembered extremely negative is Braxton Bragg. To quote one of my old veterans who was, the median age was about 80, he said, Braxton Bragg was a very sorry general. We did not have any confidence in him. And Braxton Bragg deserved that statement, absolutely did. The Corinth Campaign. Now, if you're looking at the Corinth Campaign, fought at the same time as the other 2, it's a very simple intent. Look at the map. Ulysses S. Grant is south of Corinth with 30,000 men. He's trying to march toward Vicksburg. He's trying to march toward Vicksburg from the landward side, which is the easiest way to capture Vicksburg. The only problem is you have 30,000 men deep into Mississippi, and 30,000 men eat hardtack and beef and need medical supplies and need clothing and need ammunition. And they have horses that also have needs. And you have artillery that has to be kept up. And you have powder that has to be supplied. And every day you have to have tons and tons and tons of that. And we've talked a lot in this class about logistics. And Grant was somebody who understood logistics, and he was not happy. Grant was not happy that his supplies had to come down a single railroad. And those supplies started in Paducah, Kentucky, and they went for about 200 miles from Paducah, Kentucky down to Corinth, Mississippi. And every little bridge, every little creek their bridge went over was a potential bridge to be burned by Confederate cavalry and Confederate guerrillas. And so Grant had more men guarding the railroad than he had marching on Vicksburg. And his main supply base, in other words, the immediate supply base for his army, was located at Corinth. And this is where at Corinth, General Rosecrans was in command of Corinth. And Earl Van Doren was in command of a combined army, his troops along with the troops of Sterling Price from Missouri. And by this time, Sterling Price troops had gone from being rank amateurs to grizzled veterans. Earl Van Doren boldly attacked Corinth and actually had pulled together an army slightly larger than the Union Army under Rosecrans. And in a 2-day battle, October 3rd and 4th. At the end of October the 3rd, Rosecrans had been caught unawares. In other words, he was not prepared. His army was near defeat, but the end of the day came, darkness came, and Van Dorn determined that he would finish the battle off the next day. But of course, by the next day, the Union Army had consolidated, and the Confederates charged and charged and charged and could not break the line at Corinth, and they were compelled to retreat. And so they were not successful in interrupting Grant's supply line. Now, a little side note, what they were successful at was sending a message to Grant: this isn't going to work. And in fact, Grant did quit that campaign. He brought his army back. He himself went to Memphis after all of this was over with, and he rethought how he was going to attack Vicksburg. And in the rethinking, he was going to go straight down the Mississippi in cooperation with the Union Navy, River Navy. And ultimately, that's how he will capture Vicksburg. But the initial effort is interrupted. There's a late, even though Earl Van Dorn is technically defeated at Corinth, he does accomplish in part what he wanted to do, which was to get Grant to retreat out of Mississippi and to rethink how he was going to proceed toward Vicksburg. At the very least, Earl Van Dorn gained time for the Confederacy, if not the ultimate victory that the Confederacy needed. So what are the consequences of all of this? Well, in the short version, the consequences are that ultimately the Confederacy fails. All three campaigns do not lead to the victory that the Confederates wanted. And because they did not achieve those victories, the Civil War would last for another 2+ years. And there was going to be a lot more bloodletting, Northern blood and Southern blood, to occur. But it does mark the point at which the Confederates had their best chance to have success. Because the Confederates failed to have success, European powers, especially the British, decided to wait a bit longer before recognizing the Confederacy and giving overt support to the Confederacy. And of course, that recognition and the overt support never came. And while it's normally pointed strictly to Antietam, the fact that the Confederacy failed to gain additional recruits in Kentucky and in Maryland sent a message to Abraham Lincoln. And that message was that he no longer had to worry about offending Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri. And this enabled him to do something that he had wanted to do and that was considered to be, in Northern political thinkers, absolutely necessary to do for a Union victory. And that was to change the focus of the Civil War from preserving the Union to a war of liberation, a war that would end slavery. And so the Confederate defeats in 1862, in the autumn of 1862, gave the Union and gave Lincoln the boldness necessary to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which would follow with the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. And that in part will be some of the stuff that we will discuss, some of the issues that we will discuss in the next lecture. A coda, just something to tack on to the end of interest. Murder is most deplorable, or murder is deplorable mostly. In the American Civil War, two of the participants in these campaigns were involved in two rather notorious murders. Nelson, whose army had been defeated by Kirby Smith at the Battle of Richmond, and Earl Van Dorn. In the case of Nelson, Nelson will be the victim of a murder. And the man that will kill him, the murderer, had an unfortunate name for a Union officer. His name was Jeff Davis, Jefferson C. Davis. Jeff Davis was regular Army, West Point graduate, highly competent, good corps commander, meaning commander of regiments and beyond. He did not participate in the Battle of Richmond, but as Nelson was trying to build his army back, he needed a corps commander, and Jeff Davis was assigned to him. Unfortunately, Jeff Davis, the general, the Union general, for all his competency, and he was very competent. His position was one that he was good at, but he had a terrible temper, and he had a personality that was easily offended. And Nelson was a commander of volunteers, and Jeff Davis, Union General Jeff Davis, was regular Army, and Jeff Davis decided that he was not being given the proper respect that a regular Army officer should have. There was enmity between the two men. And so in Louisville, Kentucky, in the Galt House Hotel, and by the way, I've stayed at the Galt House Hotel, albeit a modern building as opposed to the one that was there at the time. One morning, William Bull Nelson was coming down the stairs, and as he got toward the bottom of the stairs, Jeff Davis came out of another room, pistol pointed at him, and shot Bull Nelson in the chest. And within the hour, Bull Nelson was dead. Now, what happened next? Well, Jeff Davis should have been court-martialed. He should have been tried for murder. And in fact, that was arranged. It was going to happen. But there were so many crises going on at the time, and the Union needed good corps commanders, and there were very few of them, that the trial was postponed, and Jeff Davis was allowed to continue to command soldiers. And in time, the trial never happened. In other words, Jeff Davis, the Union commander, literally got away with murder. Now, ultimately, it affected his career. When the Civil War was over with, when permanent ranks were restored, Jeff Davis, the Union commander, went back to his regular rank. Sorry about that, to his regular rank in the Union Army. But in the post-Civil War Army, he never got, he had a complete career. He retired from the Army eventually, but he never rose to the rank that he should have risen to had it not been for this stain of quite literally murdering his commander during the middle of the Civil War that was on his record. The other murder involved Earl Van Dorn. Earl Van Dorn was not one of the better commanders, Confederate commanders, but what he was good at was adultery. It was said of him that he was the bane of every ugly husband. He loved to, he loved to commit adultery. He loved to seduce women, and married women in particular. And in fact, in 1863 in Spring Hill, Tennessee, where Van Dorn was stationed at the moment, he began having an affair with a doctor's wife. And one of the doctor's wife's female friends contacted Earl Van Dorn. And this is exactly what she is quoted as saying: "General, you are older than I am, but let me give you a little advice. Let the women alone until this war is over with. Let the women alone until this war is over with." Well, he didn't let the women alone. He didn't let this doctor's wife alone. The doctor found them several times in close companionship, devoid of clothing, and warned them time and again that he did not appreciate that. And finally, having had enough, on May 7, 1863, the doctor took a derringer and came up from behind and shot Earl Van Dorn right behind the ear, much like Abraham Lincoln would later be shot by a derringer right behind the ear. And that was the end of Confederate General Earl Van Dorn. Well, I hope this lecture has been interesting. You've been able to see a major change in the dynamics of the war And I hope you look forward to some of the material that we're going to be looking at in the near future. And at this point, if Misha will be helpful, we have a few moments that we can engage in conversation. Misha?
Well, if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand or let me know. Okay, Max and Barbara, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay, good. Just out of curiosity, do we know what happened to the doctor who murdered this last Van Doren?
Yes, we do know what happened to him. And unfortunately, I meant to look that up just before the lecture started because I thought the question would be asked. And had a couple of minor crises, nothing major, but you knew I don't know what happened. I can tell you what I'll do. I'll be sending some stuff out as is my habit, and I'll send a short article on the murder and what happened to the doctor. Is that fair enough?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else? Myrna Armstrong says, I have an article, the Civil War drummer boys that you might enjoy. And she'd like your email, and she listed it there, and I can pass it on if you can't see it.
I can't see it, but if you'll be good to pass it on to her, it's Bailey F, BAILEYF at acu.edu. And I'll repeat that, Bailey F at acu.edu. And I invite anyone to correspond with me. I would enjoy that.
Anyone else? Any comments or questions? If you think of something later on, feel free to email me or Fred, and we can answer them. I guess that is it, Fred. Thank you for the first session of part 3. We look
Well, it's fun
forward
to
to
put
the
together.
rest of it.
I thoroughly enjoyed putting these together and sharing, and thank you all for giving me this opportunity. That means a lot to me. Okay. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And
I have one question.
Oh,
Okay.
somebody has a question.
oh, okay, I'm game.
When is our next session?
Misha, do you have that information?
That is, yes, that is
today.
yeah, next Thursday.
Okay, thank you.
Next Thursday, same time, same place.
Okay, appreciate it.
And the lesson will be centered around the issues of how to deal with slavery as it relates to the military and to the international politics of the time. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with you.
Okay.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Fred. We enjoyed it.
Very good. Well, yeah, everybody have a good week, and hope your fondest hopes and aspirations work out. Okay. And I need sleep. I haven't had much sleep the last couple of nights because I'm a news hound, and been lots of news out there.
Yep,
Yeah.
that is
Okay.
true. All right.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, get rid of this. There you go.